Hi there and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's APMG webinar in partnership with the Service Automation Framework. My name's Estelle Hicks-Bennett and I'll be your host and moderator today, and I'm delighted to be joined by presenter Jan-Willem Middelberg, founder of SAF. Jan-Willem is a pioneer and advocate for professionalisation in both automation and big data, and can frequently be found delivering keynote speeches or moderating at universities, technology conferences all around the world. He's safely in lockdown at the moment in Malaysia, and he's the author of several books, so we may well see another new book coming out from Jan-Willem, but amongst his books includes the Service Automation Framework. Today we're going to hear how to get started on building a catalogue of automated services. But just before I hand over to Jan-Willem, just a short bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be sent to you via email after the event. Any questions you have, please do use your chat panel, which you'll see shown on the screen there. So please do get those questions in early as Jan-Willem goes through, and we'll take those either during, if they're appropriate, or at the end of the webinar. And we welcome any feedback you have. Great to have you with us today. Over to you, Jan-Willem.
Thank you so much, Estelle, for the kind introduction. And first, thank you so much for inviting me to host today's webinar session. Always very excited to present these kinds of topics. So I think for today, we have an especially interesting webinar. And in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction and case study on how you can use service automation and the service automation framework to look at one of the key elements that is on every enterprise's agenda today, and that is the service catalog. Almost every organization delivers services towards either external clients or to different functions in the enterprise. So today we're going to focus on how can we automate those services. So let's review what we're going to talk about today first with a short agenda overview. We will start with an introduction today about what a service catalog is and how it can be used in order to explain towards customers what services are. So that will lead towards a service offering of the organization. And we'll dive into the composition of a service offering and how the different best practice frameworks relate to the service offering. We will then slowly build the bridge towards automating those services, because the reality is that most organizations today still deliver the majority of their services in a more traditional manner. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about the steps on how you can automate those services and start delivering them towards your customers in a more innovative way. And that will lead us towards the discussion of how to build that catalog of automated services. So what I've tried to do is use some case studies and examples throughout the next couple of slides to really showcase you how you can do that in a step-by-step approach. As Estelle mentioned, I would welcome any kinds of questions that you have about any of the methodologies or slides that I'm showing. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the interactive Q&A box, and we will take some time towards the end of the webinar to discuss all of these in detail. So we have a full agenda today, so I suppose we just get started with the first couple of slides. Good. Before we start understanding how we can automate services in a service catalog, let's take one step back and look at the core objective and the role of a service provider in any kind of organization. Very broadly speaking, almost every organization today will have at least a number of services that they provide. Even if you are a large production or manufacturing company, you're still going to need to provide services, whether they are to your suppliers or to your employees, or you need to provide IT services towards different stakeholders in your environment. So the reality is that almost every organization today will have a part which will make them a service provider. And in order to be successful in that, we say that we have a role of a service provider is to create value through the delivery of services. And in its very core and in its very essence, That's a very simple relationship, because on the one hand side of a service provider relationship, you have an organization that provides services, and we typically refer to that as service provisioning. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the service consumer, so the person that actually consumes a particular service. So for the people who are joining us today on the webinar, they are actually service consumers because they are consuming the information and content of this webinar. And what happens in this relationship between a service provider on the one hand side and a service consumer on the other hand is that there's this process going on of value creation. And that value creation happens through services. So if we look at the official definition of what service providers actually do, is that they go through a process of value creation through a number of joint activities performed by the service provider and consumed by the service consumer. And that all needs to happen based upon a specific service offering, because the service consumer would really like to know what is included or excluded within the service that they consume. And that is typically where the service offering and the service catalog come in. In reality, however, in most organizations, this is a very complex discussion. And you will see that there is loads, hundreds, if not thousands of different relationships between different organizations, different stakeholders, and service consumers and service providers. And each of those relationships we categorize as service relationships. So as where an organization can provide services on the one hand side, it might consume services from another service provider. So you can see that all of these relationships together very quickly become increasingly more complex. So we need to have a good understanding of how can we make sure that this complexity is reduced to something that organizations can understand better and how they can deal with that in a more efficient and effective manner. And this is obviously where the whole concept of automation starts to kick in. Because if we define a service offering, we see that services, by their very core definition, are intangible. We cannot really touch them. It's very hard to measure the quality from it by just looking at it. So that makes services, by definition, a very difficult to understand and comprehend element. So in order to grasp that, we need to start defining what that service will consist of. And I frequently refer to this as the anatomy of a service. We need to know what a service is being built up of. What are the smallest components of a service and what is included in the service versus excluded. And because any company today offers at least dozens of services, it is really important to start defining that into a service offering. So a service offering, for that reason, is nothing else than just a description of one or more services that are designed to address the needs of a particular target consumer group. For example, very common examples include, for instance, IT services, which are required in any organization, or HR services, or operations services. All of these services are consumed by anybody who works in a professional organization on a day-to-day basis. And then we also have the category of professional services. A lot of service providers provide services for money. Think about training services or accounting services or even legal services. All of this happens on a daily basis. But before we can select which service provider we want to consider or that we want to contract to deliver that service, we need to know what that service provider actually does. And we do that by looking at their service offering. And that service offering will contain a number of different elements. It may include goods, access to resources, as we see, so for instance, in software, or service actions, where a person actually performs a number of actions. Here you can think about something as simple as a hairdresser. So all of these service providers will need to provide services to their clients. But because they are all offering intangible aspects, we need to define more or less in what way the service is being offered and what is part of that service. it's very important to set the boundaries so that both the service provider and the service consumer know what is included or excluded within that particular service. And that's what we start to define in a service offering. So if we look at the theory of how we can define a service offering, we see that a service offering basically can be subdivided into smaller components. And those are goods, access to resources, and service actions. So think about a very simple example. For example, when you want to go to your local municipality and request a parking permit, then you will go and you will need to have a new piece of paper, which is in essence a good. You also need to have somebody at the registration counter to put your information about your vehicle into the parking permit, which is a service action. And you might need to have access to either a building or to an online environment where you can actually do that. So the whole service of renewing your parking permit is part of a number of key components. So that means that we can break down that service offering into smaller parts. And this is exactly what every service provider does. They break down their services into smaller components, package that, and subsequently deliver that towards their consumers. But of course, this is a process that in many organizations has not been automated yet. So let's have a look at how we can do that and how we can make that service offering a little bit more relevant towards automation of services. And that's exactly what we're going to focus on in this part of the webinar. Because whereas most organizations still offer services in a more traditional form, we now, in the last 5 to 10 years, seen a tremendous increase on focus on getting that service offering automated. And I think especially in today's day and age with the whole global pandemic and all of the restrictions that there are nowadays on face-to-face contact, we will see more and more of this automation. We're going to see more and more service offerings that are going to be completed fully so that there's no manual interaction or no face-to-face contact necessary, and ensure that people can still consume services in a very safe and efficient way. So how exactly can you do that? So, because most organizations today will have the services that they provide, and they very well know the services that they provide. But how can you take the steps to make that towards an automated service offering? And that is where the service automation framework comes in. Most organizations, as I mentioned earlier, still work in a situation which will be very similar to the picture that you see on the left-hand side. They will provide a service in a number of different steps. For instance, if you're taking a training service through APMG, for which we're hosting the webinar today, you will look for a particular training course, you will attend the training course, then you will take an examination, then APMG will send you their certificate, which are all different steps throughout a service journey. And in traditional classroom education, this all used to be done manually. So you would see a lot of different service provider and service consumer interactions going back and forth every single time. And that is what constituted a service. And that's literally the situation that we see on the left-hand side. Every single step in the service delivery cycle can be broken down into smaller and simple user actions. However, if we think about automation, we want to make sure that we can deliver that services in an interactive way. And the only way that we can do that with technology nowadays is through a platform. So the situation that we want to get through in the delivery of automated services is the situation that we see on the right, where we still have the service provider, we still have the service consumer, but now they start to interact through an interface. And within the service automation community, we're referring to that as a self-service portal. A portal that we will place between the service consumer and the service provider that will ensure that all of the communication and all interaction happens through that self-service portal. And basically what the service automation framework, which you see a picture of in the bottom of the slide, is trying to accomplish is, how do we guide organizations on that journey? How do you become an organization that you will see on the left-hand side towards the organization that you see on the right-hand side? And what we've done is that we have developed the service automation framework based on the experience of how different companies have done that. And in today's webinar, unfortunately, I don't have the time to explain the different components of the service automation framework in detail. And I think Estelle can attest that I can talk for days about that. But if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend to watch some of our previous webinars where we will explain some of the key components of the service automation framework. But in summary, this is a methodology. It's a methodology that will help organizations to move from the situation on the left and providing traditional services towards the situation on the right, where they will start to deliver automated services. So let's look at some more practical examples that you might encounter in your own organization, in your own enterprise, or maybe even in your personal life. Automated services has a very strong backbone, especially in the technology world. And IT services is one of the front runners with services that have been automated. Many organizations today will now have IT self-service portals where a lot of their users of the organization can arrange and request services on a daily basis. For instance, if your laptop is not working, you can request services through a self-service portal. If you're a developer and you would like to provision a virtual machine, you can also request the setup of virtual machines through these kinds of interfaces. The benefit of doing that within the IT service community is that it will always be online. So it really doesn't matter whether people want to, for instance, reset their passwords at 3 a.m. or whether they would like to get access to certain applications when it's a very busy day. The benefit of providing services in this way is that they are always applicable. And you can see here a screenshot of leading organizations that are incorporating this way of thinking into their day-to-day service offering. Another second very common example of services that are nowadays provided in a more automated fashion is in HR services. In any organization that will have a large number of employees, there is a lot of process-oriented requests that will coming in. For instance, travel requests, requests for expenses, claims, benefits. All of these are very frequently occurring processes that are happening in any organization, and they are a prime target for automation because the requests are repetitive and people can request things through electronic means very, very easily. So you can see here, and that's the reason that I'm showing this, is that service automation is really applicable towards a variety of different domains. And one of the other domains that I'm going to show today and for which we have written a case study previously is automation in government services. Because if you think about it, a government also needs to provide services towards their citizens and towards their users on a day-to-day basis. The example of the parking permits that I used earlier is no coincidence. This is something that happens in any city thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of times every single week. So why not take a process and automate that and deliver that in a more efficient manner? And that's exactly what we're trying to do in service automation. So you might wonder, where does the service catalog fit into that? Well, the reality is that most organizations provide a variety of different services. And this is also what you can see here on the screen. Of course, a particular city, in this case, the city of Amsterdam, where I'm from, does not just provide parking services. They will do a lot more. And that's what you can see at the bottom of this interface. You see that there are services for parking, there are services for civil affairs, there are services for waste and recycling, or for instance, immigration and registration. All of these are different categories of services. And if we look at the definition of a category of service, we could literally consider that as a category of services and therefore a service catalog. So a service catalog is nothing else than a collection or a combination of similar services or services that are similar in nature, as we can see in the next slide. So basically, what we saw on the previous picture is that all of these elements that you can integrate and start up through this interface are in fact service catalogs. So if I were to make a mapping between the previous slide and this one, you see that we're actually looking at 8 different service catalogs. And each of those catalogs will have a number of services that a user can request. And this is very similar to the way that it works in an enterprise. Remember the HR services that I talked about earlier? So we could have a service catalog for instance, leave services. We could have a service catalog for instance, hiring and firing services. All of these are different components and similar services that can be bundled together. And that, by definition, is the definition of a service catalog. So how do you build a service catalog then of automated services? Because it's very similar to the IT services or the HR services that we talked about earlier. Every organization will have a great number of these services in their organization already. So how do you move from the situation of providing these services analog or through email towards a way that is fully automated? And there's actually a 5-step approach with which you can take these actions in order to move from the situation where services are still delivered in an analog or traditional manner to delivering them through an automated portal so that users can request them by itself. And we'll go through each of those 5 points in a little bit more detail in this webinar. But if we quickly look at the flow of things, we will need to start with to define services from a user point of view, meaning that we're always going to look why would a user use this service and how would their experience be when they would log into a portal and request this particular service. And although this sounds very easy, this is actually one of the hardest points for organizations because they frequently are used to defining services from their perspective. After we've done that, we can start to categorize and bundle these similar services into service catalogs as we've just seen. The third major component, and that this component is part of especially of the service automation framework, is to take each and every one of those individual services and subsequently build a service automation blueprint for each service. The service automation blueprint is a technique that can be used in order to ensure that you separate the service provider point of view from the service consumer point of view. So by defining a service in a service automation blueprint, you automatically place that layer in between through which the service provider and the service consumer will start to interact. This service automation blueprint can subsequently be used as a blueprint for the design of the technological solution. Because we remember that we're talking about automation. And one of the key characteristics of automation is that we will need to put this into workflows and scripts because an automation or an automated service will need to run all by itself. And this is exactly what we will do in step number 4. In step number 4, we will translate those service automation blueprints, which are designed, into workflows and scripts, and then make them available through the self-service portal. And then in the last step, which we might not need to forget, is that we need to ensure that people actually start using this self-service portal and interface. So we need to make people aware that it exists. We need to engage people and make sure that they start working through that self-service portal. And again, very similar to the first step, this is one of the most difficult aspects because the technology from a technological point of view is always easy to arrange. Getting people familiar and actively starting to use it is something completely different. So exactly how do we do that? In the next couple of slides, I will dive into each of those 5 steps in a little bit more detail. In the first step, as I mentioned, we're going to define services from a user point of view. So this is for a lot of organizations a different way of thinking a different way to look at services, and also one of the most difficult aspects. Because most organizations up to today, and I've seen this happening in loads of organizations, always define services from a service provider point of view. So very traditional statement, for instance, for parking permits, which is the example that I've used so far, would be that our city is responsible for the distribution and renewal of parking permits for its residents. Whereas in a traditional service catalog, this would be a perfectly fine statement. It lacks the user point of view, because if you are a citizen which would actually need a new parking permit, you need to be able to find out where you can request one. It needs to be a good experience, and the process of requesting this parking permit needs to be pretty straightforward. So in this first step, we're going to start understanding our user and starting to define all of our services in the service catalog from a user point of view. So the same service, but in a different way phrased, looks like the sentence that we see at the bottom of this slide. So as a particular citizen, I would like to request and renew my parking permits and submit changes in case I buy a new car. And just by rephrasing it into this different way, you can already see a lot of the features that we will need to incorporate within our self-service solution. We need to have a request workflow. We need to have a renewal workflow. We also need to have a workflow that can deal with submitting changes in case the person buys a new car. So here, right away, we're going to figure out a completely new way of defining our service catalog. And that's really the first step. In the second step, we will then look at all of the services that we will have in our catalog and group them into similar services of categories. And this is really what starts to constitute our service catalog, because you would like to have a number of different services that are all aligned and are managed, for instance, by a specific department. So here on the slide in front of you, you can see some examples of different categories of services that you might want to make available through a similar self-service portal, which will all have a different focus. And the result of that is that there will be different governmental departments that will look after that. So if we take, for example, the services that we see on the right, we can have services for reviewing school directories, enrolling in preschool, switching between schools, requesting education grants, requesting language courses. All of these would be educational services, which could be part of the same service catalog. And that is why we're grouping them together and putting all of these services together under the same automated service catalog. What we will subsequently do in step number 3 is that we're going to compose a service automation blueprint for each and every individual service. And the service automation blueprint is a structure and a way in which you can separate the technical requirements and from the service provider side, which you will see at the bottom of this slide, from the user actions and the user experience, which are happening on the other side of the self-service portal. In the middle of a service automation blueprint, we always separate this by the self-service portal or the technological solution. So by doing this, you will get a new workflow and you will have an idea of how a service will actually flow through an organization. So unfortunately today, we don't have the time to dive into the whole technique of service automation blueprinting in more detail, but we've done a webinar on this topic previously. So if you're interested in that, look at the YouTube channels from APMG or Service Automation Framework, where you can find more details on how to actually compose a service automation blueprint. The key thing and the key takeaway in this 5-step approach is that for every single individual service that is part of the service catalog, you would need to start designing an automated service blueprint, because this will provide the design that you will subsequently be able to put into a workflow and script. And by designing all of the services in this similar way, you can really start to manage your service catalog. So that if, for instance, there is a change to your service or there is an update towards the workflow that will request the service, that this can be managed in the same and an efficient manner, because you first will update the service automation blueprint, and then you will adjust the technological scripts and workflows and processes. So an automated service catalog is basically nothing else than the collection of a number of service automation blueprints. And after we have this step complete, we actually start to make these and translate these into workflows so that we can make them available through the self-service portal. And this is really where it becomes visible from a user point of view. Remember that this is the slide and the picture that we've seen earlier. So from a user point of view, I'm just seeing the front end. I'm just seeing here how I can, for instance, request a new parking permit. I click on the first box and it will guide me through a number of different services that I can choose from. And this is exactly what happens, because what we're basically doing is that we're opening a service catalog and that we're selecting an individual service from that service catalog and subsequently execute the workflow. But from a user point of view, we don't see all of that backend work, but it needs to be designed in an effective and concise manner. And that's step number 4. We're almost done and getting towards step number 5, because the last major point is that there is a responsibility for the service provider to facilitate active use. And this is where I've seen a lot of projects either fail or be very successful. This has a lot to do with this last step, where users need to be made aware that these automated services exist and that this self-service portal where the services are offered is actually live and available, and that it's more efficient and quicker to request services in an automated manner. If the service provider does a good job in marketing these automated solutions, you will see that the usage of those automated services will grow over time, because people, especially in today's day and age, actually like to arrange things on their own. Think about all of the smartphones that we're all carrying. People would like to do quick service requests and immediately get responses. So companies who are able to do this effectively will see a lot of growth in terms of service automation. And that's really the last step to make sure that you translate that into your catalog of services. So let's recap the 5 steps in a high-level design overview. What we've talked about so far in this webinar is really what are the steps towards the automation of your service catalog. And if we go through the different steps that we talked about, we see that we will need to start with considering the individual services that the organization already offers. And the service provider wouldn't be in existence today if it didn't have those services already available. The next question, however, is how do we automate that? So we'll take a particular service catalog of services that are being offered, and for each and every individual of those services, we will start to compose a service automation blueprint. So here we see moving from a catalog of services towards a design of automated services, which is done through the service automation blueprint. Then in the next step, we will make those services available through an automated portal, which we will call the automated service catalog. And this is where the services will become available from a user point of view. So this is where you and I can request our new parking permits, arrange our school registrations, or for instance, request new passports. All of these are services that we request on a daily basis. And it will be way easier if we have an automated portal where we can request this in a very effective manner. So I hope that this webinar gives you a bit of an indication of the different steps that you can move through to move from a traditional service catalog towards one that contains automated services. I would like now to invite Estelle back into our call in order to moderate some questions, because I saw a lot of questions come in during this webinar. And then we will move into our Q&A, and I can provide some additional resources that you can see here on the slide in case you would like to get in touch with us and figure out more information about the service automation framework. Estelle, back to you.
Many thanks indeed, Jan-Willem. That was an amazing presentation. As always, there's always something new to learn in these, and I found it particularly interesting to look at those sectors that you've been working with there. Interestingly, one of the questions is there a sector that uses SAF more than others? Is there one that uses it in a more popular way?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good question. Well, what I've seen in my experience with service automation is that the framework tends to be mostly adopted in industries that have a lot of high volume, repetitive, process-oriented requests. So we've done a lot of work, especially in local government, which is one of the case studies that I showed in this particular webinar, but also industries like banking and insurance, where there's a lot of services that are being provided on a day-to-day basis and that need to be done in order to, for instance, to be compliant or to service customers on a day-to-day basis. So a couple of criteria is really that it's a process-oriented organization where there's a lot of repetitive requests coming in.
Thank you. We've got one that says blueprinting. Is this the same as process maps?
It is closely related to process maps, but I would say that service automation blueprinting goes one step further than that because it has more of a structured approach. So that it is a way in which you can ensure that you design an automated service. So it is very similar in terms of business process management, in terms of separating different actions that would need to be taken, but it does follow a structured path. And I think that's why it's a little bit different from BPM, where you frequently start with a blank canvas. Here there is a little bit more guidance on how you should complete them, because in the end, we want to make sure that we have a structure that we can maintain well and that every organization can use in order to actually maintain their automated service catalog. So it's a very good question, Estelle.
Great, thank you. And there's one here, someone's saying, which role in the organization would you say typically heads up at this, the service automation?
Well, that's a very good question. And this is also something that we have seen very different answers to in recent years. Traditionally, I would say is that most of these projects were always initiated more from an IT point of view, so from a service provisioning point of view. But recently, we work more with more of the business side, because in the end, I would say that service automation is a different business model. Because if you do this particularly well, you can see that it starts to generate business for the company. Because having more automated services means that customers and users can use this 24/7 in a completely different way, and you can have customers all over the world. So in the last couple of years, we've seen basically a shift more from the IT domain towards more business users, who are now also using these technologies and the framework in order to deliver services towards end clients. And I think that's a very interesting development.
Thank you, Jan-Willem. And just the last one here, which I think you've sort of touched upon really, I guess, with the sector, and you did show the slide outlining it, but they're saying, who would you say benefits most from service automation capability? And I don't know if they mean sector or person, but I don't know if you're able to help with that one, please, Jan-Willem.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think that the part of the organization that benefits most from automation is obviously an operations department or a service delivery department, because they are used to doing a lot of repetitive work very manually. And this also is where service automation touches upon other developments like robotic process automation, where a lot of robots are used to kind of automate some of the workflows that we designed in this service automation blueprints. But this is traditionally, I would say, the departments that are relieved through automation. It is where work is done over and over again in a similar fashion. So think back about the examples that I gave earlier about departments which, for instance, need to issue parking permits. This is a repetitive process that happens thousands of times every single week. So this, you can imagine that those departments are best helped by automating these processes that will deliver these forms of services automatically. So I think that's the best answer to the question, Estelle.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. That's all the questions we have for now, Jan-Willem. So it just leaves me to say thank you once again very much for an information-packed webinar. That's so brilliant, so much learning to be done there. And obviously anybody that is interested in training or certification, you can visit us on the APMG website, and I'm sure Jan-Willem would be very happy to hear from you on his LinkedIn account as well if you need to ask him any further questions. We will be sending out the slides and the recording to you on an email afterwards, and we'd like to thank you all very much for joining and for the questions that you've submitted. Thank you very much indeed, Jan-Willem.
Thank you so much, Estelle, for inviting me. It was a true pleasure to do this, and thank you so much for all of the participants to take the time to be with us today, and I hope you find this webinar informational. Thank you so much, and please keep posted on any of our other upcoming webinars.
Bye-bye.